Lately, I've been encouraged by the fact that the young people, the students, have resumed leadership, which I was afraid that they had given up during the McCarthy era. I spoke at several institutions. I spoke at Princeton and Chicago and I think the University of Illinois, quite a number, but the students didn't respond. They seemed to me awfully dull. And I just made up my mind that this was an age where we were not going to have the inspiration of the young. And now, suddenly, without any encouragement on my part, and little encouragement on the part of others, comes this sit-down, where the students have put their finger on a very important point. The Negro problem, of course, is a problem of mob violence and of disfranchisement and of injustice in the courts and of difficulties of getting decent jobs. It's all that. But in addition to that, the Negro problem is a series of little meannesses which are really unimportant, that help nobody, and yet which all of the Negroes have to meet, and which most of them simply meet and say nothing. I mean the fact that you go downtown shopping, you can't get a sandwich or a cup of coffee. There are towns down there where you can't sit in the park. You can't go to the movies, or if you do go, you have to go to a very unpleasant place at the top. All sorts of things of that kind which have been going on, and which in my day we simply said, well, gracious, we've got to stop people being murdered. If they can't get a cup of coffee, that's a little thing. But the students put their finger on that, and they fought, and it was hard fighting. I went down to North Carolina and saw some of them and heard the story of what they've been doing. And they've kept it up. And it's really a part of a worldwide movement of students. The students in Turkey who made it impossible for Mr. Menderes to give his welcoming speech to NATO, to the tremendous revolution in South Korea, where they got rid of a scoundrel, and of other student movements, and then, of course, of the great awakening of Africa. Well, that gives me a good deal of satisfaction. Evidently, the older people like myself are not needed just now. They're younger people who are going on and doing their own thinking. And I congratulate them upon it. They don't need any advice from me. Perhaps I need some from them. In the earlier days, in the latter part of the 18th century, in the beginning of the 19th century, the Negroes in America considered themselves African. They called their organizations African. There were African clubs. There was the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church and so forth. Then there arose a movement among the whites to help them return to Africa. And the Negroes suddenly realized that what they were doing was to get rid of the free Negroes and of the more intelligent Africans so that they could have only Negro slaves here. So there came a tremendous revulsion of feeling. And from the middle of the 19th century on, there was one thing that the American Negroes were determined not to do, and that was to return to Africa. Anybody that talked about return to Africa was not in good odor. Then there came the efforts in Liberia and so forth, which were pretty difficult, and Sierra Leone. Bishop Turner, Bishop of the African Church, tried to encourage some migration to Africa, but didn't succeed. And then with my Pan-African Congress movement, there came the idea that American Negroes, having better chance at education and so forth, could help the African. But that was bitterly opposed by the colonial powers. They didn't want any American Negroes out there stirring up trouble. And the Negroes in America were not particularly enthusiastic. For instance, the NAACP supported the first two Pan-African Congresses, but not the others, because, as some of the trustees said, we've got enough problems here in the United States without going to Africa to look up others. So that there wasn't much American Negro support for the Pan-African movement. Now, on the other hand, there comes through the African trade unions a renewal of thought and ambition among a new generation of Africans. When the African members of trade unions met in Paris with the trade unionists of the world, they found, to their surprise, and they fought it, that the English trade unions, for instance, wanted to speak for the African trade unions. Well, the African trade unions said they were there and they're perfectly able to talk for themselves. And they won. And that was the reason for the split that came in the trade union movement. Meantime, the Africans there asked for a fifth Pan-African Congress, and that's the reason that fifth Pan-African Congress began. Now, they were the people that went back to Africa and began this new movement. And today, the leadership of the Negro race is going to come from Africa and not from America or the West Indies. In fact, they are going to inspire work here that we haven't been doing. And for that reason, you have this tremendous beginning of independence and autonomy and freedom from white rule in Africa. Now, on the other hand, the American Negroes have become very much American. And a good many of the American Negroes see now a chance in Africa to make money. And of course, the whites have always seen that chance. So that you have here in New York City today some 4 organizations which are African organizations and which believe themselves or pretend to believe that they are helping the African movement. As a matter of fact, most of them are trying to help American investors get in on the ground floor in Africa. And that I've tried to set myself against. Africa needs capital, but what I've said, I broadcasted from China last year. You need capital, and you must save your own capital just as much as possible. And you must avoid getting capital from the United States, which is going to tie you down so that you will be unable to be really free if you are part of the investment system. That if you can get capital from the Soviet Union at 2%, you ought to get it. If you can get it from China, help with that sort. The point is to get capital, but to get it as cheaply as possible, save it for yourself, and not tie yourself up by spending a whole lot for consumers' goods that you haven't gotten on for a long time. Without refrigerators or automobiles in Africa. You can get on a little further than that. And for that reason, I'm not a member of any of these African organizations and haven't been asked to be a member.